Trick or treat. Anne smiled down at the trio of kids on her front porch, dropping a fistful of candy into each of their waiting bags. Don't you look cute? Happy Halloween! They had come as the Avengers. A Hulk, a Thor, and a Captain America gathered on her doorstep in search of treats. Anne had seen a lot of different groups, even a few singles, but all of them had complimented her on her elaborate yard decor. As the three superheroes gushed about how cool it was, too, she smiled and gazed out at what she had created this year. She gazed at her kingdom, but she couldn't help but look fretfully around for the shadows that had plagued her for the last few weeks. Anne had sunk a lot of time into her yard display over the years, and she hated that this year's display had a pall cast over it. Anne's yard displays were always the talk of the neighborhood. She'd spent years collecting things for each season, and as she looked across the yard of foam tombstones, moving zombies, flashing ghosts, and a nearly 20-foot-tall moving skeleton that her nephew had helped her rig up, she was pretty happy about how her graveyard had turned out. That was to say, nothing about the fog machines that added ambience to the place, and the motion sensors that brought a few of the undead screaming from their graves when someone walked too close. Despite her trepidation, Anne realized that she was already planning the additions to next year's Halloween layout. She still had plenty of black foam and spray paint, not to mention all that acrylic paint from the craft room. She could make a mausoleum to go with the graveyard, maybe even a few open caskets to dot the yard. Anne had been retired for nearly a decade by now, and it was nothing for her to spend days out in the shed as she fabricated decorations for this holiday or that holiday. The thought of going back into that workshop now, though, made the hair stand up on her neck, but she knew that she would. Anne wouldn't let anything stop her from what she loved most. She set out a spread for every holiday, that was true, but she saved her best work for Halloween. Halloween had always been special to Anne. Her mother had begun setting up their yard on September 30th every year for as long as she could remember, and her mother's spread had always been something to see. Growing up in a strictly religious family, Anne's mother had never been allowed to celebrate Halloween. I watched from the front window every year as the other kids went by in their colorful costumes and longed to be a part of it. Now, I make up for lost time by having the best yard and the best costume, she always declared proudly. She wasn't wrong either. Anne's mother was always the envy of the cul-de-sac, and her daughter had certainly taken after her in that aspect. She poured so much effort into her decorations, and as one of the kids jumped at a rising zombie, she knew that the first place prize for the best yard contest would be hers again this year. She heard the chuckling to her left, the sound rankling her as she turned to see who had snuck up on her. Who was laughing? No one should be laughing. Screaming, running, jumping with surprise. These were the things that her decorations inspired. The only laughing should come after the scare, and the chuckle then should be relieved and full of silent thanks that it had been a trick. This laughter, though, it had been merry, downright robotic, and she would see who had dared to chortle at her expert display. She felt the familiar stab of fear at the sound of that laughter too, because it was the laughter that had ultimately run her from the workshop. She had been so busy preparing for Halloween that she had nearly put it off as a trick of the nerves. She'd been working since August on this year's display, and between the tombstones and the countless undead she wanted to make, she'd been pulling 12-hour days in the workshop. This was going to be her best year yet, better than her Hansel and Gretel gingerbread house, better than her ghost pirate crew, better than her haunted corn maze even. This year, she was going all out, and she had nearly broken the bank doing it. So, when the little chuckle began to echo from the depths of the workshop. Anne had put it down to too much coffee and not enough sleep. Then she began seeing things from the corner of her eye. Just little things at first. Shadows, skittering shapes that never quite materialized. But she shook these megrims away as well. They were nothing. She would finish the graveyard and start on the scarecrows for her Thanksgiving display. She would finish ahead of schedule, start putting the corn and pumpkins and turkey up the day after Halloween, and go along as she always had. But then, as she worked late one night, she finally saw what had been dogging her steps and had yet to return to the workshop. She had heard the laughter as she was shaving another inch off the last gravestone, and looked up to see a grinning shade crouched in the corner of the little building. It was closer than she had expected, nearly in biting range of those massive teeth, and the tombstone had made a hollow thunk as it fell off the bench. She had scuttled towards the door, her heart racing as the undulating shade took a step towards her. It loosed that canned laughter again, its mouth opening like a snake's mouth as the shadow split like oil, and she had slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with the key as she ran for home. She had finished up the last tombstone in the kitchen, and had been thankful that all the zombies were stacked on the back porch. Now, however, there was no door to slam, no lock to run, and it was just her and the intruder that was hunched on her porch railing. Standing on the rail, watching her from beneath a tatty, yellowing bedsheet, was a little ghost. The kid couldn't be more than 7 or 8. He was so small, but as it looked at her, the wind pushing the hem of the sheet a little, Anne felt a shudder run through her. It was as if a goose had walked over her grave, and as she tried to form some kind of greeting, explanation, or anything in between, she found her thoughts sucked away like cows in a whirlwind. "Wow, Miss Anne, your graveyard looks amazing!" Anne cut her eyes back to the front and saw Debbie Garrison walking her too big Toto up the walkway as the hem of her Dorothy costume bounced merrily. She was smiling like she'd never seen the place before, and jumping in surprise whenever something rose up to startle her. Anne couldn't help but smile as she waved at the girl's mother, still back on the sidewalk with Debbie's 8-month-old brother, and when she looked back to the little ghost, it was gone. "Just a bit of Halloween mischief, I suppose," Anne said, picking up her bowl as she went to go greet Dorothy and her very large dog, too. The Garrison's black lab was all wagging tail and lolling tongue, and Debbie was giggling madly as the big lug pulled her towards the porch for pets. Anne obliged, scratching him behind the ears as he liked to have, and tossing him a popcorn ball as she filled the little girl's bag with treats. Debbie lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, and when it came time to sell chocolates or magazines or just somewhere to sit and gawk at the pretty decorations, Debbie seemed to always come here first. She was the closest thing Anne felt like she'd ever have to a daughter or a granddaughter, and she was glad the little girl had come for her yearly candy haul. "Did you get a lot of candy this year, Debbie?" Anne asked as she emptied the bowl into her sack. "I sure did, Miss Anne. Mommy and me went all over, but I wanted to come here last so I could see your cool decorations." Anne smiled. "I'm glad you did. Here," she said, shaking the other bowl over her bag. "I think you'll be my last trick-or-treater for tonight." Debbie gasped. "But Miss Anne, what if the other kids come for treats?" "I don't think they will. It's almost 9, and the other houses are starting to shut off their porch lights. If any latecomers show up, I guess they'll have to come early next year," she said with a wink. Debbie smiled, but Anne saw it morph into an O of surprise as she looked past her. "What about that one? Is he a friend of yours, Miss Anne?" Anne turned, but She could already hear the growl coming from the oversized Toto. She already knew what she would see there, and the dirty ghost child didn't disappoint. He was standing between her and the door now, hunkered over on all fours like an animal, as that soft chuckle rose in him like a cricket at dusk. Every hair was standing up on the dog's back, his hackles high as he prepared to charge. If he did, the little girl would likely be hurt, and when Anne stepped up next to her, it was as much for the protection of the dog as to hold on to its lead. "Debbie," her mother called, oblivious to what was going on a few feet away. "Come on, honey, it's getting late. Your brother's ready for bedtime." Anne had looked away for only a second, but as she turned back, she heard the growling dog become confused as the little ghost vanished back to wherever it had come from. "Miss Anne?" Debbie asked. "What's wrong? Totoro, why are you growling?" Nothing, Anne said, fixing her smile back into place. "You two run along now. We wouldn't want to keep your mother waiting." She turned, putting her back to the door, but as she waved, that laughing crept up her spine like cat paws. Anne had never been afraid within the circle of protection provided by this cul-de-sac, let alone in her own yard. But what she wanted most at that moment was to turn tail and leave with Debbie and her mother. It would be unthinkable to leave her home, a home her mother had tended so lovingly. And as she turned again to face the laughter, she was greeted by an empty porch. She didn't know what this was, what sort of spirit was haunting her home, or why, but she was less than self-conscious as she ran up the stairs and through the front door, locking all 3 locks behind her. She suddenly found that she didn't care if she had any last-minute trick-or-treaters. Anne flipped the switch and turned her porch light off, letting them know that she was done passing out candy for the night. With her back against the door, she heard the scamper of bare feet as they pattered across the porch. But to her horror, it sounded like more than a single pair. It appeared her little shadow had friends, and Anne hoped that her door would be enough to hold them. She thought about calling the police, but what could they do against spirits? Her best option was to sit in the house and keep the door between them and her. Outside, she could hear something setting off the motion detectors, the hollow sound of zombies groaning as they popped up, and reached over shakily to the extension cord by the door. That was easily fixed. She'd unplug it. Then they couldn't set off anything. She could sit in here, safe and sound, and they could just scamper around out there till they got enough of it. If they were spirits, then they couldn't just come in without an invitation. They'd be gone by first light, and that was how ghosts worked, right? When the sun rose and Halloween was over, they could go back to their world and leave her alone. When something crashed in the yard, however, Anne realized that she might have underestimated them. She peeked out her window and saw that the huge skeleton she had set up had fallen over, and her yard was now a shamble of broken gravestones and splintered wooden zombies. The skeleton had been heavy, but she hadn't realized it was that heavy. Her hand was on the knob, ready to go out and defend her precious decorations, but she froze there as she thought better of it. She couldn't do anything to them, not really, and she could always make more decorations. It hurt to lose them, some of them having been with her for years, but she was more afraid of the shades than she was mad about the destruction. When the chuckling came right up to the door again, she backed away as if the wood might bite her. "Come out! Come out! We need your skill." The voice was thin, whispery, like mice feet on wax paper, but even within the words, she could hear that canned laughter. The sound of it made her skin crawl. "I won't," she said, her words choked with sobs. "I won't come out. You can't make me. Just leave me alone." She hadn't been this scared since she was a child, and the realization made it even worse. The laughter was like something out of a mental health ward. It was like the laughter that bubbles from the depths of hell. When it was cut off by the barking of a dog, she heard it swivel as if they were turning to see what had brought it on. "Miss Anne?" came a cherubic voice. "Miss Anne, are you okay? I was taking Totoro out to do his business when I heard a loud noise. Miss Anne, are you all right?" The laughter was merry, gleeful, as they discovered they had another toy to play with. "No matter," they lilted. "We'll just take her instead." The feet darted from the porch, and when Debbie screamed, it was cut off suddenly by a small and hesitant laughter. Anne felt her breath hitch as it grew in volume. The girl moved to merriment by the laughing shadows. No, not Debbie. They could take her serenity, her security, and her decorations. They could invade her yard and her workshop, but she wouldn't let them have that little girl. She was out the door and onto the porch as the laughter took on a choking quality, and she could see both Debbie and the lab lying on the sidewalk and writhing with laughter. Debbie was clutching her throat and gasping for air, trying to breathe past the laughter and failing. The dog, the one with the odd name she could never remember, well, she had never heard a dog laugh before, and it was clear that the vocal cords of the animal were not set up for it. It made a soft, chuffing sound, like sneezing but higher pitched, and it too seemed to be struggling to breathe. The shadows that stood crouched around her looked up when Anne shouted at them, and their smiling, gleeful faces made her all the madder. "Stop it! Stop it! Stop hurting them! Leave her alone, and I'll do whatever you want. Take me instead, but leave her alone. She's just a little girl. She has her whole life ahead of her. Stop it!" Anne was crying by then, fat, ugly tears that ran down her face. But when one of the creatures lifted her chin with a dark finger, she felt a chuckle bubble up through the sorrow, like water from deep within the earth. "Come with us, then. We need your help," it rasped. My help?" she said, the laughter becoming infectious. "Yes. We will need sets and costumes for the show. You will find your talents are in high demand." Debbie had stopped laughing, lying so still on the sidewalk that Anne thought she might be dead until she saw her breathing. She nodded, getting up as the laughter gripped her like a fist. She went laughing into that dark place, and her disappearance was quite the neighborhood mystery for years to come. It seemed that the gallery got their trick-or-treat that year, and they were merrier for it. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.